was looking through some things on my computer the other day, some pictures, and I saw photos of when we had Jamie Sloan, an artist here. We had an opening for him. The hallway was packed with people. And as I looked at that, I thought, that doesn't even seem real. You know, that was like a lifetime ago that we could do those kind of things. So, anyway, thank you all for coming here. You know, I'm so pleased that we could do the Harry Bertoia show because, you know, I've been talking to Celia about what a symbol that fountain is of Marshall, and you know, everywhere you go in Huntington, you see pictures. I was actually reading an article in the Washington Post about the Marshall football program 50 years later, and the fountain is there. They have a picture of it, so it's everywhere, and it's really hard to believe that at one point in time it was controversial, the design. And Celia will talk more about that. But you know, I'm getting ready to retire from here in just a little bit, but I really wanted to stick around to do this show because you know what it means. I mean, I was 15 years old here in Huntington, and you know, for 50 years I've carried around this sense of loss and pain, like a lot of people in Huntington have. I mean, not like some families have, but you know, when the We Are Marshall movie came out, I didn't know if I could watch it or not, you know, because there's such, you know, feeling inside. But anyway, I'm pleased that we can do the show, and thanks so much to the Polan family for sponsoring that in memory of Dorothy and Lake Polan Jr. And I've got several other sponsors for the exhibit I need to read. So the Isabelle, Gwynn, and Robert Daine Exhibition Endowment, the West Virginia Department of Arts, Culture, and History, the National Endowment for the Arts with approval from the West Virginia Commission on the Arts, and the National Endowment for the Humanities and Federal CARES Act through the West Virginia Humanities Council. So that's almost a lecture in itself. But, before you leave, we'd love for you to grab one of these forms, the Humanities Council. They like people that attend these things to fill one of these out, a little checklist. There are 25 pencils over there, so you can have your own. So please do that if you would. We'll pass them out or give them to you when this is over. Well, Celia Bertoia is here tonight to deliver the Dr. Lawrence B. and Shirley Gang Memorial Lecture. And Dr. Gang, I knew him when I first came here, and I've been here a long time, but he was a local physician and you know, a great supporter of the museum. And his wife Shirley, I did not know her, but she was a longtime docent and museum volunteer. But the family set up an endowment to provide for a lecture series over the time. And we've had a lot of, you know, over the years, many of these gang memorial lectures. So we're grateful again to the Gang family for that. So I'd like to get to introducing our guest. Celia Bertoia is the youngest daughter of Harry Bertoia, and I got to driven her around a little bit and got to talk to her about her life. And so she spent a lot of years in real estate and fundraising, and even she and her husband had a race timing business too that did the timing at road races and things like that. So quite an interesting life. In 2013, she founded the Harry Bertoia Foundation and now spends her time as director of that. So she's a qualified fine arts appraiser and, of course, is an expert in appraising and authenticating Harry Bertoia chairs and sculpture and pieces like that. So without further ado, I'd like to turn this over to Celia Bertoia. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. And I must say, Chris Hatton here of the museum has been a very gracious host, driving me all over the place, and inviting me here many months ago. We didn't know if it was really going to happen, but I'm very happy to be here and to have some live humans to speak to. And these kinds of presentations are very energizing for me, and usually I give 6 or 10 of them a year, and this year, of course, has been very different. So my last lecture was in February, and I know probably some of you haven't been out and about since then either. So I celebrate that you are here. Thank you. And what I hope to do this evening is not only share a little bit about my father's history and how he ended up doing the sculpture here in Huntington and the history of the fountain piece, but perhaps I can invite you into Harry's world and show you who he was as a human being and why he turned out to be the perfect person to create the memorial sculpture for the Marshall tragedy. And we'll have plenty of time afterwards for questions if you have any. And I've put some of my business cards on the stage here if you want to contact me. But with no further ado, let's talk about Harry Bertoia. He clearly was born in 1915 and only lived 63 years, contracting lung cancer from all the welding and the toxic fumes. So his passion turned out to be the end of him as well. But Harry, as a youngster, grew up in Italy and had somewhat of a carefree life as a child and would help with the grape harvest and the chores. He went to school only up until about 5th grade because that's just how it was in rural Italy. And he did take a few art lessons from an art teacher in the next town over who would ride his bicycle. But within a very short time, just a few months, this teacher came to his parents and said, look, this kid is very talented. He's already beyond my level, and you need to send him to a legitimate art school. He wanted to go to Venice, which was about 50 miles away, but would have been quite expensive to attend a school there. Or did he want to go to America, where his brother, his older brother, Oresta, was already established. He's 7 years older. So Harry always had kind of a difficult time making these life choices, and at age 15, you can imagine what was going through his mind. But he made the choice to come to America. And that's Oresta, his brother, and there's Harry at age 15, looking a little thunderstruck. And Oresta was working at the Ford plant. This was in Detroit. So that was a good job. And he said to Harry, basically, look, you're the one with the talent. I want you to go to school. I will house you and protect you. And you make your way in the world. So Oresta was a guardian angel, if you will. And that's exactly what Harry did. And he was a hard worker. He got scholarships everywhere he went, and he ended up, finally, going to Cranbrook. Now, who here has heard of Cranbrook? Okay, great audience. Well, Cranbrook at that time, now he went there, let's see, he entered when it was 1937, and he got a scholarship, so he met with Elio Saarinen, who looked at his portfolio and I'm told just accepted him right there on the spot. And the agreement was that he would start out as a student, but eventually he would take over the metalsmithing shop because he had already learned some metalsmithing at the tech school, Cass Tech So he began his stint at Cranbrook, and it was there that Harry's life really turned around. He met a lot of important people. There was Charles Eames, who has a chair in the exhibition, if you've had a chance to see that. Eames came into Harry's career in a little while later when he invited him to come to California and design furniture with him. We have Eero Saarinen, the son of Eliel, who was the director at the time. Eero became an architect, a well-known architect, and of course furniture designer as well. And Eero was the first person to give Harry his first monumental architectural commission. And we'll see that in a little while. But he knew Harry was a hard worker and trusted him to make a huge sculpture, which was kind of a leap of faith. And we've got Florence Schust at the time. Everybody called her Shu. She later married Hans Knoll, so they created Knoll Furniture, and that's where Harry later, he worked with them and created the Bertoya line of chairs, the Bertoya collection for Knoll. This was my mother at that time, and her mother was into horoscopes and astrology, and she told Brigitte that she would meet her husband when she was still age 19. So she had just come from Germany. Hitler was in power and the war hadn't started yet, but there were rumblings of it. And her father, Wilhelm Valentiner, at the time was the director of the Detroit Institute of Art. And he could see the writing on the wall. So he had Brigitte and her mother, Cecilia, who I was named after. He said, you better come over here. They were still in Germany. So he brought them over to the U.S. And Brigitte didn't really have anything to do. She had just gone to finishing school in Switzerland and learned how to make fancy French sauces. And here she's kind of waiting around for a husband, really. So they decided to put her in Cranbrook, and not that she had any artistic ability. I've had a chance to see the reports from that era, and the teachers, what they would write about Harry, oh, we wish there were more hours in the day, very talented student, oh, he's incredible. And then you see Brigitte, doesn't listen to her instructors, very willful, no talent. Mom, I love you. But anyway, she met this handsome young man and took a jewelry class from him. That's what he looked like back in those days, so you can see why she fell in love with him. And they were actually married at Cranbrook. So some of the things that he did at Cranbrook were, he got into jewelry making. We have a few examples in the exhibition. But he made hundreds of pieces there. And he came to learn that he was a metals man. He just loved working with metal. And at Cranbrook, I think he really got a feel for that. He was able to experiment with lots of different metals. He loved to work with gold, of course, because it's so malleable and beautiful. Silver was his next favorite metal, but he worked with copper and bronze and even aluminum. So all kinds of things. And he also got into printmaking. Now when I say printmaking, of course immediately you think of, oh, you have an edition of 100 prints. But he would make monoprints or monotypes. And again, we have some wonderful examples in the exhibition here in Huntington. But this was a skill that he learned at Cranbrook. There was an old printing studio down in the basement that he discovered. He would go down there after hours and just do all kinds of wonderful prints. And the prints that came during the Cranbrook era were really the most creative monotypes of his entire career. He continued to use that technique later on for planning his sculptural work, but the graphics that he did at Cranbrook were art in themselves, as you can see by these examples. So he learned some great skills there at Cranbrook, and he was there for 7 years. So finally, he married Brigitta and then was kind of ready for the next step, and that is when Charles Eames invited him to come to California and help him design chairs. Eames and Saarinen had won that famous Museum of Modern Art competition for modern furniture, or their chair model won, and part of the reward was they got enough money to help them be able to figure out how to mass produce these modern chairs. So that was Harry's task, to go and help them figure that out. So he went to California. They had my sister Lesta. They were living in Santa Monica, beautiful beach paradise there. And they actually spent about 7 years in California. The whole Eames story is, we won't get into that this time, but he worked with Eames for a number of years and then decided to move on. And they were a little bit floundering in California because Harry was selling his monotypes and his jewelry, but here Brigitta has a baby, and she told us at one point she had to sell her German jewelry just to buy diapers. So they were struggling. Well, then the next phase comes along, and that was the Knowles. Hans and Florence Knoll. They were in Pennsylvania. And although they didn't have Twitter and email back in those days, they all kept in touch, all these Cranbrook alumni, with postcards, phone calls, whatever. And Florence, who really knew how to put together the right people, she had heard of the parting of ways of Bertoya and Eames, and she thought to herself, you know, we should pick up that Bertoya guy. Because she had seen how he operated at Cranbrook, very hard worker, very creative. So she sent a letter inviting him to come and design furniture at Knoll in Pennsylvania. But that did mean he would have to leave beautiful California. And he wasn't quite sure if he was ready to do that. Then they had my brother Val. He was born there in California. So, you know, they were a happy little family there. But Brigitta, bless her soul, they were quite the balance for each other. Harry was more serious and slow to make decisions, very thoughtful and depthful. Brigitta was more like a butterfly, and she'd flit around, and she loved parties and always ready for the next adventure. So here's this letter from the Knowles sitting on the kitchen counter for a week, or a few weeks, and Brigitta is thinking, come on already, make a decision. So, and Harry was thinking about it. Well, Brigitta took it upon herself. She wrote to the Knowles and said, yes, we're happy to accept the position, we'll see you soon, and thank you. And then another letter comes back. Oh, Harry, we're so excited to have you come to Pennsylvania. We're looking for a place for you. And Harry's a little confused. He says, Brigitta, I don't even remember making a decision. What's going on here? And she says, oh, I told them we're coming and I just forgot to tell you. So they made a very fateful move to Pennsylvania, and the ultimate result was the Bertoya collection for Knoll. And again, by the examples in the exhibition, it's just such a classic, timeless set of designs that I was talking to these folks earlier, that it was modern in the 1950s and it's still modern. I mean, you look at it and it's just, it fits in with almost any decor and it's iconic. I mean, you still see it in home magazines and design publications all over the place. Now, Harry worked for Knoll for about 2 years, from 1950 to 52, and he did the whole shebang. And now we have specialists for everything. There's the designer, there's the graphic designer, and then there are the engineers and the production people. Well, they went from A to Z. He created the designs, and again in the exhibition there's one of the original jigs that Harry helped put together. So they figured out, and since he was a metals person, he loved working with wire, that was his natural choice for material. But furniture up to that point had been wood. It was made out of wood. So they had to really shift their thinking around how they were going to make these things. And so it took some doing. And at one point, Florence she was getting frustrated because they had gone to a company and they said, can you make these jigs, and how are we going to do this? And it was going to be really expensive. And she's saying, yeah, we've already spent so much money, maybe we should just dump the whole project. You know, as in any process, there were many glitches along the way, but the chairs finally came out in 1952, and it was all good. The rest is history. This was actually a prototype of the Asymmetric chaise lounge, which was designed back in those days, but because it was asymmetric and they didn't have computer programs, you know, they didn't have AutoCAD and all those things that make designing something like this much easier. So they decided at that point to not produce that chair. But then, there were a couple of prototypes, one made by Harry and one made by his assistant. And one of these prototypes came up for auction in Chicago at Wright Auction. And it sold for $119,000. And of course, Knoll was taking a good look at that. So they called up Richard Wright and said, hey, we'd like to get the specs on that, because they had drawings, but they really didn't have anything else. And Richard Wright very generously said, you've got 24 hours. So they sent some guys over, they measured this thing, took all kinds of pictures, and the ultimate result was that Knoll came out with the Asymmetric chaise lounge in 2005. They presented it at the Milan Furniture Festival, which is kind of the biggest design festival in the world. And the Asymmetric chaise lounge by Vertoya, the first year's production sold out right there at that fair. And it's not an inexpensive piece either. So the furniture happened, and Pennsylvania was very good to Harry, and I just put in some pictures of my father and myself because my siblings tell me that I was the favorite child, and you know, I don't have anything to compare it to. I was the youngest, so to me it was all normal. But we really did have some kind of simpatico, some kind of connection that I think the other two siblings didn't fully have. And perhaps I was the most similar to him. We both had the blue eyes. He was from northern Italy, so he had lighter hair and the blue eyes. My mother was from southern Germany, so she had dark hair and dark eyes. So anyway, we just always had some kind of bond. And perhaps that's why I ended up in this position, which, as Chris mentioned, I've done a lot of other things in my life and really only started this role less than 10 years ago. And I'm still learning, believe me. But it's, you know, when I do these lectures, I always feel that Harry is kind of right there. So, here we come back to Eero Saarinen. Now there's Hans Knoll in his Manhattan office, and you can see that little Bertoia sculpture in the windowsill. While Harry was designing the chairs, on his own time, he was creating sculpture, and this was a common type that he was creating at that time. And they had an open house, an introduction of the Bertoia collection in New York, and of course invited all the designers and architects. Well, Eero Saarinen came and saw that little sculpture and said to Harry, you know, I'm working on the General Motors Tech Center up in Warren, Michigan. Do you think you could make one like that, but make it about 40 feet long? And Harry said, sure, why not? So that put him on the path of making these architectural commissions. This was his first one. This was erected there in 1953, and it's still there. Now, they don't like you to see it, but if you, when I went up there, and I said, well, I'm the daughter of the artist, can't I? Say, oh, no, yeah. So, honestly, I took a clipboard, and I had my cousin with me, and I just pretended that I was someone important, and I walked into the building and got to see it. So, you could probably do that too, but don't tell them I told you. So, Harry was very influenced by nature. Of course, other artists had their influence on him. When he spent time with Brigitte's father, Valentiner had introduced into Detroit all the modern painters, Kandinsky, Paul Klee, Jean Miro. So Harry saw these when they were new to the world and was very much influenced by them. But when people would ask him, well, what were your biggest influences in your career, he always said nature. And you can see, you know, you've got nature and Bertoia. And while he didn't try to exactly replicate nature, I think what he managed to do was to imbibe the essence and then interpret it in his metallic way. And here, you know, you've got this, that's gold-plated, but it's metal. And when I think of metal, it's this stiff, hard substance. But that just looks like this soft, fluffy dandelion. And same with that one. So he was a real whiz with metal. Same with this. You've got Utah red rocks and Vertoya bronze. Now, at a certain point, Harry got involved with his sounding sculptures. And again, we have some nice examples there in the exhibition. And you must get one of the docents or Chris or somebody to play them for you. Because if you only see them standing still, well, that's very nice, but you're only getting a portion of the experience. Harry became almost obsessed with his sounding sculptures. And they were very simple structures, just a base with rods, and then you touch them and they make these sounds. But back in the 70s, this was kind of unheard of. I mean, nowadays, if you Google sound sculptures, you'll find hundreds of entries. But this was a new concept. And Harry would go into the barn. We had this old 1750 bank barn in Pennsylvania that he remodeled and made into a concert hall of sorts. And that became his laboratory, his man cave. He would go in there and just play around, and it really occupied him the last 20 years of his life, or 15. So this is just another picture of the Sunambian collection. And we are, by the way, looking for a museum home for this collection now so that it can be enjoyed forever, which is what Harry wanted. And I like this photo. It's a little bit hard to see, but here's a 2-rod tonal, which Harry had placed there before he died. It was just outside the barn in Pennsylvania. And these 2 trees grew after that tonal was placed there. And I like to think that, well, yes, Harry was influenced by nature, but perhaps nature was influenced by Vertoya. So we'll get into more of the Marshall history now. Keith Daine, right here, was the architect who designed the Marshall Student Center, and he was the one who suggested Bertoya for the memorial sculpture. And I think there were several other artists who were suggested, and they all interviewed. And you know, I couldn't find a photo of Lake Polan Jr., but there were a number of letters in the archives. And I know that Lake Polan was very instrumental. He was apparently on the committee which was interviewing these various artists. Now, the story goes, and this was in some of the articles that Chris released, that Harry went to the meeting with this art committee, which included Lake and several others. And of course, they started asking him questions, and you're looking back at the 70s, and Huntington is sort of a traditional town, and the thundering herd, you know, they're thinking, well, are you going to make a buffalo or a football player? And Harry, at that point, he was in the height of his career. He didn't have to take a job if he didn't want it. So he said something like, look, if it's a buffalo you're looking for, then I would like to be removed from consideration, because a buffalo I will never make. And so he probably showed them some sketches of ideas he had, you know, these abstract forms. And so here's this committee, and they're thinking, oh, you know, who is this guy? Some kind of hippie, and he always had kind of long hair. He looked a little disheveled. But I really give a lot of credit to Lake, because I think it was he who convinced them all that let's go with this guy. He knows what he's doing. And luckily, they did. So then Harry had to think about, okay, what is right for this project? Now, architects love to work with Harry for several reasons. One, he would give them a financial estimate, and then he would stick to that figure. And that takes quite some skill and some planning. In fact, one of his workers who also worked on the Marshall Fountain, Ed Flanagan, he told me later as I was writing the book and gathering data, he said, yeah, Harry, he was just so great. He would tell them a figure, and if for some reason it came in under that amount, he'd give them a refund. He'd give them the extra money. You know, who does that? So that was one reason. But another reason was that Harry had a real knack for creating the right piece for the project at hand. And I don't know exactly how he did that, but he really was able to visualize things You know, he could see the finished piece in his mind. And so as Keith Dean showed him the area where this was going to go, and the whole story of what had happened, and the tragedy, and you know, how the whole town was so affected, 75 people dying. And Harry had always wanted to do a memorial piece. So this was his chance, and it actually was the only one that he ever did. And Harry had very definite ideas about death and dying. And he had been raised Catholic, but we were an unchurched family. We went to church maybe on Easter sometimes, but he was very spiritual. And perhaps the Marshall piece was actually sort of a precursor or a dry run for his own death, which the Marshall piece came here in '72, and he died in '78, so it was only 6 years later. But he really had this whole idea that death is just one more phase of life. It's not something that we should mourn over and be miserable for years and years. I mean, of course, you have feelings about it, and you have to work through those. But to take the spirit of those people who passed and put that inside yourself and move forward. And that whole, the upward movement and that the fountain, it's really reaching heavenward. And, you know, it is very uplifting. Now this was the maquette, which is also in the show. I thought it was quite amusing that this article that came out at the time, again, these were newfangled modern forms, and they accidentally put the maquette upside down in the article. And I think and then I saw another letter from this journalist, and he was so embarrassed that he had done that. But that just gives you an idea of how new these abstract forms were at that time. So here's Harry and Jim Flanagan working on, this was actually a different piece, but very similar. And you can see the construction is basically just copper tubing, the same kind of copper tubing that you would find in residential plumbing. Simple industrial material. So they had to heat these copper pipes enough to bend them so they wouldn't split or break. And then once in place, they put the bronze welding rods there and welded each pipe next to the next one. So it was a very time-consuming and lengthy process. When Harry had a vision in his mind of what he wanted to create, he didn't take any shortcuts, and if something like that had never been made, he just figured out how to make it. He would invent these various techniques. He was just a very creative spirit. And he was sort of a liaison between the industrial age and art. He put these two together, and also the sounding sculptures. Those are just metal rods that you can get from any metal supply company. So he was able to take these very ordinary materials and turn them into magic. I don't know how he did it, really. I mean, we know the technical aspects, but to have that vision. And he had the maquette. He would have the maquette right there on a stump of wood, and he would follow that maquette. Now, we can see that the maquette is actually a bit wider and shorter than the final sculpture. And I'm not really sure why that is, but I suspect he really wanted to emphasize that upward momentum. So he made it more vertical and a bit narrower. So he built this thing, and he had made several other similar fountain pieces, and they took a long time. As you can see, it's just one pipe at a time. And normally they took 9 to 12 months to construct. But this one, they just worked and worked on it, and they didn't have quite as long. And this was actually the only photo of the construction of the Marshall piece that I could find. And it's pretty fuzzy, but you can see it all coming together there. And then there's the final piece. And one thing I love about my father's work is that he never made it perfectly manicured. Just as in nature, it's sort of this imperfect perfection. You know, all the rods, they're not at the same level, and it's just kind of rough. But that adds to its allure. So Harry was not just an artist, but he had to do everything else besides. He was working with the sprinkler company to figure out how the water would flow onto the fountain, and, you know, ordering all the materials and figuring out the weight, and just all these other aspects of being an artist that most people don't really think about. And I wanted to show you this whole timeline because it's really kind of astonishing. So the initial interview was in August of 1971, not quite a year after the plane crash. But they had to make their decisions and figure out the budget and whatnot. So he didn't actually have a signed contract until February of '72. And they told him that, hey, look, we need this sculpture by the date, November 14th, so get on it. Now, so the total fee was $25,000, and that was to cover all his workers, all the material, everything. And who knows what that piece is worth now? Probably $1 million, I don't know. But it seems like such a low figure. And the contract, Harry always hated when they had 20 pages about what if the artist reneges, or, we're not happy with the sculpture. So Harry simply said, look, if you're not happy with it, pay me $1,000 and give it back to me. Simple. So actual construction didn't begin until May. So we're talking June, July, August, September, October, 5 months. So they were cranking on that. Normally it did take at least 9 months. So I think they put all their energy into that sculpture. And it was delivered, and they finally had the dedication. And I love that they have the film going of the dedication in the exhibition there, because the unveiling, it just shows how important this was to the town, and still is. I couldn't believe it, just walking around town for this 50th anniversary. You're seeing signs in the store windows, and we went to see the sculpture today, and the families taking pictures with the sculpture, and I get chills thinking about it. It's so meaningful to the people in this town, to this community, and I think that's really beautiful. And Harry always hoped that even after he died, he would leave his mark somehow, and I think he really succeeded, at least with this piece. And even at the annual celebrations, or not really celebration, but the gatherings, many people come, and they're still very important to the town. And I'm sad that this year it has to be so limited, but I think people are able to watch it on the big screen and whatnot, so that'll work. The piece itself is just stunningly beautiful. This is the first time that I've seen it in situ, and it almost brought tears to my eyes. I mean, it seems like it's been there forever. And Chris was telling me how when Harry was here for the dedication in 1972, someone made a comment to him that it seemed like that piece had always been here, that it just fit in so well. And that was the highest compliment Harry could hope to hear. And that was the whole organic thing. You know, he was so inspired by nature, and with the trees around the sculpture, it just almost feels like the sculpture is just another organic thing in nature there. Now, for this particular sculpture, Harry won the gold prize from the American Institute of Architects, which is a very high honor. I mean, it's pretty incredible, and he got several of these awards. And then later on, when people would ask him, well, Harry, which project was this award for? And he would say, oh, you know, I don't even remember these awards. They come and they go. It just wasn't important to him. What was important to him was that he created a form that was right for that situation. And if he happened to get an award for it, well, he didn't really care. And I would be remiss if I didn't bring up Beverly Twitchell. And there's her perfect little 70s hairdo. But she was a professor here at Marshall in art history, and she ended up having a Bertoya exhibition at Marshall, and she met Harry, and she was just enthralled with him, because he was quite a charming man, I have to say. And I mean, he would get mad at us kids sometimes, but overall, people just loved him. He was easy to talk to. He was just sort of a regular guy, but yet very thoughtful. And Beverly Twitchell and Harry Bertoia had a wonderful relationship, kind of mentor-mentee, but Beverly still talks about him to this day. She wrote a scholarly book about him, which she had promised to do when he was still alive. She said, Harry, I'm going to write a book about you someday. And here she was in her 60s, pushing 70 when she finally wrote the book. But she said they could talk as equals about art and artists. And Beverly actually sort of shaped her life to be near Harry. She would visit our homestead every few months, and they had a nice rapport. And Harry loved to talk to young people. You know, she was in her 20s at that point. In fact, something he liked to do at an opening, he would go to these openings, you know, the whole family would go if it was close by, and he would sort of sneak around and try to hear what people were saying about his works, especially young people. If there were students there, he'd maybe stand behind a group and, oh, what are they saying? And then he would approach them and say, oh, what do you think? And because he felt that he got his creativity from a divine source, and it happened to come out through his hands. So he never signed his work, and that's why I have to do all these authentications, because there are copies of his work now. So he didn't sign, and he didn't title his works. He didn't give them a name, because he said, you know, okay, I created, but I want the viewer to have their own experience with the work. I mean, some people might look at that piece and it looks like a tulip to them, if it's a gardener. Or someone else might see it and it looks like some kind of shovel or a tool. You know, whatever your life experience is going to influence what you see in a Bertoia sculpture. And that's how he wanted it to be. Whereas so many artists, Picasso comes to mind, he wanted people to know what year it was, the title he gave it, and what was going on in his life, so that you could relate. And that's, you know, there's some relevancy in that too. But Harry just had a completely different approach. And Beverly's book, like I say, it's a scholarly treatise, very nicely done. And this is my book that I wrote, which is much more of a memoir, lots of family lore. And I will say, just to try to explain a little bit more about who Harry was. Of course, as a child, you're with your parents, you think your family is just normal, because that's all you know. And at the dinner table, we never talked about logistics. It wasn't, you know, oh, who's going to take Celia to her dentist appointment tomorrow? You know, nothing like that. It was, where were we before we were born? Is there life on other planets? What's the meaning of the universe? I mean, huge questions. And that was our dinner table discussion. And I thought that was normal. So when I was going to school and I would give that kind of question to people that are kind of looking at me like, you know, and my friends started telling me, Celia, you have to talk about the weather first. You can get there later. But it's just a favorite picture of mine. I was probably 18 at the time, and we're walking down the road near our home. And you can see we have a similar energy. You know, we're both just moving right along. I have very serious focus, and sometimes my husband said, you know, I'll be working on something, and he's saying something, and I just don't even hear him. I'm just like, he said, hey, planet Earth, Cecilia. So anyway, we had a great relationship, and as mentioned, he did die early from the lung cancer. This is a 10-foot diameter gong that became his grave marker. You can see the little cat there as relatively, and that gong, the sound carries for miles. We actually did an experiment where, that was before cell phones, but we had one person there, one person at the shop, which was about 3.5 miles away, and at the synchronized time, he's banging on the gong, and you could actually hear it at the shop. So I don't know what the neighbors think, but we thought it was appropriate for a big spirit to have a big gong. And again, relative to the Marshall tragedy was what Harry said to the 3 of us children on his deathbed, basically, as he knew he was dying. We all knew he was dying. And it was such a beautiful talk. I wish I could remember more of the specifics, but the gist of it was that, look, Harry says, I've had a good life. I've lived a full life. I have made my mark on the world. When I'm gone, I don't want you to cry and mourn for forever. I want you to take my spirit, imbue it into yourself, and go forward. Just like with that fountain, that you move from that place. You know, all the people who we love, who are past, they're still in us, and they make up part of who we are. and they help propel us to the next step, whatever that is. And for me, which I certainly didn't know when my father died, that step was to create the foundation. And if you're ever out St. George Way, if you're going to Zion National Park, please stop in. And I've left some business cards here if you ever want to get in touch with me. And it's been quite a journey. I never expected some of the things that have happened, but it's all good. And really doing this kind of talk is very energizing and wonderful for me. So again, I thank you, and we'll have plenty of time for questions. So thank you. Yes, Blake.
True story. When the committee was debating of Vertoya or Buffalo, my father sealed the deal. He said, "In which end of the Buffalo do you expect the water to come from?"
Oh, that's great. Yes.
About the sound sculptures, what was your father's genesis for that? Was it some kind of holistic approach to art, and then he liked sound, so he thought that might be a good thing to integrate, or was he just kind of banging away like a metal shop?
Well, that's a great question. She's asking what was the genesis of the sounding sculptures. And I'm sure it was perhaps in the back of his mind for many years, but the actual event that precipitated it was he was working on a wire sculpture, just a little thing. And as he was bending a piece of wire, it broke off and sort of flipped into the air and made some sounds. And of course he must have heard that hundreds of times before because he'd been working with metal wire all his life. But somehow, and that was in 1959, somehow that event just gelled in him, and he thought, gosh, I wonder what would happen if you put 10 wires together, or 20, or 100. So from that point on, he started experimenting, and some of their very first experiments are in the exhibition. Again, it's really a wonderful little exhibition. He made those grid bases, which were very time-consuming and not that effective. And he fairly quickly realized that to make a flat base made a lot more sense and was easier. And there was still an evolution of the sounding sculptures. The tall one that's so nicely conserved. That was sort of his final iteration of the sounding sculptures, because he finally realized that he could drill holes into the base and then put the rods in there with a jig, and then braze them, solder them, and that made for a much more stable sculpture that the wires wouldn't fall out easily. So yeah, he made his very first sculptures in 1960 and continued until his death in 1978. Thank you for that question. Yes, Blake.
It's really large in some Chicago town sign. How do they hold up? Is there a conservation issue?
They do pretty well. I mean, of course, they do get a very dark patina. The problem with the outdoor sculptures that are in public places is that they're too well loved, and people tend to be yanking on them or try to climb them or whatever. And the ones in Chicago, and that used to be 11 pieces. It was a much larger array, and they've whittled it down to, I think it's 5 or 6 pieces. And the times that I've seen them, they're just all askew, and it hurts my heart because they're really in bad shape. But as far as surviving in the outdoors, they do fine. They do get dark, and I think the patina probably affects the tone a little bit. But But yeah, there are a number of outdoor pieces that have been out there for many years, and they're okay. I mean, every once in a while, a lot of these places that do have the large outdoor tonals, they will clean them up, but you don't really even have to. Harry enjoyed seeing that evolution. I mean, even his barn collection, when they were first in the barn, they were just all shiny and beautiful, and after 15 or so years, they all started to mellow and the colors would deepen, and he liked that. Now, some of the outdoor sculptures, like the Marshall Fountain, they do tend to get what some people call bronze disease, where things, metal and bacteria and things start growing, and sometimes that can start eating away at the actual sculpture. So that does have to be taken care of. But the tonals are not usually patinated, whereas the sculpture, you can see the green, that was patinated. So it depends on the sculpture. And now again, I've had some people in California who've had pieces out there and right by the ocean. So that salty air, there was a gum that was out in the salty air, and it after a while it started to get sort of pitted, and I mean it was actually quite beautiful. So it depends on the owner, and if they like that added roughness. But yeah, they survived quite well. Okay, maybe we've exhausted it. Well, again, thank you so much.